The crying reached him before he saw her. It was the kind of crying that a person does not perform for an audience, the kind that tears itself out of the body in ragged, ugly waves, the kind that shakes the shoulders and bends the spine and hollows out everything a person has been holding together for too long. Isaac Graves heard it from 40 feet away, carried to him on the dry August wind that swept across the mesa outside Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, in the summer of 1882, and something in his chest cracked open like old timber under a boot heel. He did not announce himself. He did not call out some lawman's greeting or rattle his spurs deliberately to warn her. He simply walked across the hard-packed earth, past the other graves with their modest wooden markers, past the wild sage that had taken root along the cemetery's border, and he sat down in the dirt beside her. Beside Abigail Rhodes, who was pressed against the freshly turned mound of earth with both hands flat against it, as though she could push warmth down through the soil to whoever lay beneath. The marker read Thomas Rhodes, 1821–1882, her father. Betrayal and grief had conspired to hollow her out, and Isaac sat close enough to feel the heat radiating off her and said absolutely nothing. He had known Thomas Rhodes for 3 years. He had played cards with the man on Friday evenings. He had eaten the man's wife's biscuits. God rest Margaret Rhodes too, gone these 4 years now. He had watched Abigail grow from a quiet girl who observed everything from door frames into the kind of woman who commanded a room without raising her voice. And now he sat in the dirt beside what remained of the last of her family, and he could feel her looking at him from the corner of a swollen eye, waiting for him to say something useless and well-meaning, the way everyone else in Redemption Creek had been doing for the past 3 days. He did not say a word, and somehow that silence broke something open in her that all the words had failed to reach. She wept harder for a moment, then gradually, the way a storm exhausts itself, she quieted. The sun was hammering down on the mesa, and somewhere behind them a mockingbird was running through its repertoire, indifferent to grief. Isaac stayed. His badge caught the light and threw a brief flash across the grave marker. Abigail wiped her face with the back of her hand, a rough, unself-conscious gesture, and finally looked at him directly. "You are the only person in 3 days who has not told me it was God's plan," she said. "It was not God's plan," Isaac said. "It was Samuel Cutter's plan, and I intend to prove it." The name landed between them like a coal ember dropped on dry grass, and everything that had brought them both to this cemetery on this particular afternoon began to unspool backward in Isaac's mind, all the way to the beginning of the hidden motive, the dark past, and the trap that Thomas Rhodes had walked into without ever knowing it was there. 6 weeks before Abigail Rhodes found herself pressing her palms against her father's grave, the town of Redemption Creek had been enjoying the closest thing to prosperity it had known in its 7-year history. The railroad surveyors had come through in the spring and declared the Mesa corridor a viable route, and the land speculation that followed had turned neighbors into rivals overnight. Thomas Rhodes, who ran the only hardware and dry goods store in the territory for 30 miles in any direction, had suddenly found himself in possession of something more valuable than inventory. He owned the lot at the end of Main Street, and the lot behind it, and the lot behind that one, and those 3 lots, according to the railroad company's preliminary maps, sat directly in the path of the proposed depot. Samuel Cutter arrived in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday in mid-June, and the town noticed him immediately. Men like Samuel Cutter were designed to be noticed. He was tall in the way that suggested dominance rather than simple height, with a silver watch chain and a tailored coat that spoke of St. Louis money, if not St. Louis manners. He called himself a land broker, and he set up an office in the back room of the Desert Rose Hotel. And within a week, he had bought 3 properties from families who did not know the railroad was coming, and had no reason to suspect their scrubby parcels of near desert were worth anything more than they ever had been. Isaac Graves had been Marshal of Redemption Creek for 4 years by that point. He had come to the territory from Kansas, carrying a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising, and deeply uncomfortable with secrets, which was, he had always thought, the combination most likely to keep a man alive in this business, while also making him almost universally unpopular with anyone who had something to hide. He wore his star on the left breast of a plain dark coat, kept a Colt single-action Army revolver on his right hip and a smaller pocket revolver in his left boot, and moved through town with the particular economy of motion that marked a man who had learned to conserve energy, because he never knew when he would need it all at once. He had noticed Samuel Cutter the day the man arrived, and he had noticed something in the noticing that he could not immediately articulate. It was not anything overtly wrong. Cutter was smooth and legal on the surface, and the properties he had purchased through proper channels. But there was a quality to his interest in Thomas Rhodes's lots that exceeded what a legitimate land broker would demonstrate. He visited the hardware store 3 times in the first 2 weeks, and each time he left without making a purchase, which was an odd habit for a man who claimed his interest was purely mercantile. Isaac had been keeping an informal eye on all of this when he first had what he would later describe, in the report he filed with the Territorial Marshal's office, as a meaningful exchange with Abigail Rhodes. It happened at the post office on a Thursday morning. Isaac was collecting his mail, which consisted almost entirely of wanted circulars and administrative correspondence from Santa Fe, and Abigail was arguing quietly but with remarkable precision with Postmaster Henley over a package that had arrived, addressed to her father, but had been signed for by someone else. She had arranged the facts of the situation with the clarity of a person accustomed to having to prove things to people who did not take her seriously, and she won the argument in about 4 minutes, walked out with the package tucked under her arm, nearly collided with Isaac in the doorway, and looked up at him with eyes the color of creek water in early spring, somewhere between brown and green, and impossible to name without getting it wrong. "Pardon me, Marshal," she said, and she had already moved past him before he managed to respond. He thought about those eyes for the rest of the day, which struck him as an entirely unhelpful development. He made a point of stopping into the hardware store 2 days later on what he told himself was legitimate business, which was true in the sense that he did need a new hinge for the office door, but was also true in a different sense that he was not ready to examine too carefully. Thomas Rhodes was behind the counter, a big, weather-worn man with an easy laugh and hands that had been reshaping iron and timber for 40 years. Abigail was working the ledger at the back desk, and she glanced up when Isaac came in and then went back to her numbers, which for some reason he found more interesting than if she had stared. He talked to Thomas about the hinge and about the railroad rumor and about the dry summer, and as he was leaving Thomas called after him, "You staying for supper, Marshal? Abigail's made her mother's green chili stew and there's more than 2 people can eat." Isaac looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at the ledger. "If it's no trouble," Isaac said. It was not trouble. It was the best meal he had eaten since arriving in Redemption Creek, and the conversation at the table was easy in a way he had not expected, because Abigail, who had been so composed and contained in every context he had observed her, turned out to have opinions about nearly everything, and was not particularly interested in softening them for the benefit of a stranger. She thought the railroad was going to change things in ways that were not entirely good. She thought land speculation created a false economy that hurt the people who stayed and benefited only the people who moved on. She thought Marshal Isaac Graves had been allowing the 2 men who ran the gambling operation behind the livery stable to do so without sufficient scrutiny, which was a direct challenge delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made it impossible to dismiss as rudeness. "Those men's games are not rigged," Isaac said. "One of them is," Abigail said. "The faro layout. The dealing box has a crimped spring." Isaac set down his fork. "How do you know that?" Because 3 of my father's customers have come in to buy goods on credit this month, which they have never done before, and all 3 of them have been playing at that table," she said. "I pay attention to patterns." He had shut down the faro game within the week. The dealing box had a crimped spring. After that, he made a habit of talking to Abigail Rhodes whenever his investigations led him into territory where patterns mattered more than brute force, which was most territory worth caring about. She was 24 years old and had been running the operational side of her father's business since her mother's death, and she had developed a mind that cut through available information the way a good blade cut leather, cleanly and without wasted motion. She was not a woman who performed helplessness, and she was not a woman who waited for permission, and she was not a woman, Isaac gradually understood, who would ever be easy to love, if by easy you meant uncomplicated and undemanding and willing to occupy the quiet background of a man's life. He was completely lost before he had a name for what was happening to him. He knew it for certain on a Saturday evening in early July when he watched her face across the dinner table while Thomas was telling a story about a trading disaster from 1860, and she was laughing with her whole body, completely unguarded, and Isaac felt something in his chest so unfamiliar and so enormous that he looked away quickly, the way you look away from something too bright to hold in focus. He was 31 years old. He had been a lawman for 9 years and a marshal for 4. He had had relationships, brief and carefully limited, with women in 3 different territories, and each of those had ended with the mutual understanding that his work made permanence impossible, and that this was simply a fact about him rather than a failure. He had come to believe it himself. He had stopped examining it. And now Abigail Rhodes was laughing in her father's kitchen, and Isaac Graves understood, in the particular clear way you understand something that has been gathering evidence for weeks, that all of his careful self-limitations were about to become irrelevant. He did not tell her. He was not, at that moment, in a position to tell her, because the matter of Samuel Cutter was beginning to demand his full professional attention, and mixing what he felt with what he needed to do was the kind of mistake that got people killed. The situation with Cutter had darkened by the middle of July. Isaac had sent a letter to the county land office and received back information that set his teeth on edge. Samuel Cutter had operated in 3 other territories over the past 6 years, always in advance of railroad construction, always purchasing land from people who were not yet aware of the railroad's route. And in 2 of those territories, there were unresolved questions about individuals who had refused to sell and who had subsequently encountered difficulties. In one case, a man named Pritchard had died of what was ruled an accidental fall from his own barn roof. In another case, a widow named Esteves had suffered a fire that destroyed her property deed and her nerves simultaneously, and she had sold to a Cutter associate within the month. Isaac had no proof. He had patterns, and patterns were Abigail's currency, not yet his. But he kept the information close and watched Cutter more carefully, and he also, for reasons he acknowledged to himself were not entirely professional, began making sure that someone was keeping an eye on the Rhodes property on the evenings when he could not do it himself. He asked Deputy Hector Morales to take the evening patrol past Main Street and Rhodes Hardware, and Hector, who was 22 and observant and had the kind of loyalty that did not require explanations, said yes without asking why. Thomas Rhodes turned down Samuel Cutter's first offer on the 14th of July. Isaac heard about it from Thomas himself, who seemed unbothered. "The man offered me 60 cents on what the land is worth," Thomas said when Isaac came into the store the following morning. "I told him I was not in the business of giving things away." "Did he say anything when you turned him down?" Isaac asked. Thomas laughed. He smiled the smile of a man who expects to be told yes eventually. "I have seen that smile on every salesman who has ever walked through my door. It does not concern me." Isaac did not say, "It concerns me." He said, "You might want to mention it if he approaches you again." Thomas said he would, and went back to stacking canned goods, and Isaac left the store and walked directly to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe, requesting information on any active investigations involving Samuel Cutter by name. The reply came back in 48 hours. There were no active investigations. There were 2 closed investigations that had both been filed without charges. The territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe was, Isaac suspected, not particularly interested in land speculation when it occurred at the expensive end of the market. He was on his own. He told Abigail about his suspicions on a Tuesday evening while they were sitting on the porch of the hardware store after Thomas had gone inside to sleep. He told her the outline of it, the pattern across 3 territories, the unanswered questions about Pritchard and the widow Esteves, and he watched her face go very still in the way it did when she was calculating something. "He has approached Father twice now," she said. "Father told me about the second approach this morning." Cutter raised his offer significantly. How significantly? Enough that Father is considering it. She paused. "I told him to wait." Isaac looked at her. "Why?" "Because when someone raises their offer significantly and quickly, it means they are running out of time or running out of patience," she said. "Either way, patience on our side costs us nothing and costs them a great deal." He looked at her for a long moment in the early evening light, this woman who thought in terms of leverage and patience and the strategic value of waiting, and he said, very quietly, "You should be careful, Abigail." She turned to look at him, and something shifted in the air between them, something that had been building for weeks and now pressed close enough that he could almost name it. "You have not called me by my name before," she said. He had not. He had called her Miss Rhodes. He had been careful about the distance of that formality. "I apologize," he said. "Miss Rhodes." "No," she said. "Do not apologize." She looked back out at the empty street. "You should call me Abigail. We have shared enough dinners to justify it." They sat in silence for a while after that, and the silence was not empty. It was full of things that neither of them was ready to say out loud yet, and Isaac thought that perhaps there was something to be said for waiting, even in this. Thomas Rhodes received his 3rd visit from Samuel Cutter on the 2nd day of August. This time Isaac was not watching. He was dealing with a situation 12 miles out of town, a dispute between 2 cattle ranchers that had escalated from a property argument to a gunfire exchange that had, by the grace of some frontier miracle, not killed anyone, but had destroyed considerable fence and most of the goodwill between 2 families who would need to coexist for the next 40 years. He was gone for 2 days resolving it, and when he came back into Redemption Creek on the evening of the 4th, something felt different about the town in the way that things feel different when you know them well enough to notice absence. He went to the hardware store. Abigail met him at the door, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who had been waiting with good news. "Father signed," she said. Isaac felt the ground shift slightly under his feet. "When?" "Yesterday morning. Cutter came in while I was at the mercantile collecting the mail. By the time I came back the papers were signed and the man was gone." She was holding herself with extraordinary composure, but her hands, at her sides, were pressed flat against her skirt in the way hands press when they are trying not to shake. "Father said the offer was more than fair. He said there was no reason not to sell." "Did Cutter say anything to persuade him? Pressure him in any way?" "Father said the conversation was perfectly pleasant." She paused. "Father has been tired. He has not said so, but I have noticed. He is 61 years old and he has been running this store since before I was born, and I think perhaps he was more willing to let it go than I knew." Isaac did not say. This could mean nothing. The sale was legal. Thomas was within his rights. He said, "I am going to look into it." She looked at him. "You think it is connected to what you told me, Cutter's other operations?" "I think it is worth examining." She nodded. The composure held, but barely. "Thank you, Isaac," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice was something he would carry for a long time afterward, specifically because he would not hear it again for nearly 3 terrible weeks. Because 3 days after Thomas Rhodes sold his lots to Samuel Cutter, Thomas Rhodes collapsed in his store and was carried to the physician's office by two customers who had been browsing the nail bins. And Dr. Paul Farrow, who had studied medicine at a proper institution before following his nerves and his dreams west to New Mexico, examined Thomas and came out of the back room with an expression that translated clearly as, "This is serious, and I am not certain I have the tools to address it." Thomas Rhodes had suffered what appeared to be a severe poisoning of some kind. The symptoms were consistent with arsenical contamination, Dr. Farrow said carefully, though he could not be certain without equipment he did not have, and arsenical poisoning occurred in many ordinary circumstances, from contaminated water to rodenticide compounds that were common in hardware stores and other places where goods were stored. It could be accidental. It could be many things. Isaac stood in the hall of the physician's office and looked at the closed door and thought about the timing. Thomas had signed the papers. The sale was complete and legally registered. There was no remaining reason to do Thomas Rhodes harm if the motive had been acquisition. The land was already sold. Unless the harm had not been intended, unless Thomas had begun to express regret or second thoughts, unless there was something else that Isaac did not yet know. He went looking for Samuel Cutter and found that Samuel Cutter had checked out of the Desert Rose Hotel that morning and was gone from Redemption Creek entirely. Isaac sent wires in 6 directions. He contacted the county seat. He contacted Santa Fe again, more urgently this time. He spent 48 hours going through every legal and recorded interaction between Thomas Rhodes and Samuel Cutter that he could locate, and he found something that changed the shape of what he was looking at completely. In the deed of sale, buried in the technical language of a secondary clause that Thomas Rhodes almost certainly had not understood when he signed, there was a provision, a reversal clause. If Thomas Rhodes died within 90 days of the signing and his estate made no claim on the property, the sale price would be considered final, and the property would transfer to Cutter's holding company without any encumbrance. But if an heir existed and contested the clause within the first 30 days, the deed could be reopened. Abigail Rhodes was the heir. She was also, under the terms of this hidden clause, a potential obstacle to Samuel Cutter retaining the property cleanly. Isaac went directly from his office to the hardware store with this information folded in his coat pocket, and he found Abigail behind the counter with her father's ledger, already managing the business with the practical efficiency of a woman who did not have the luxury of pausing, and he told her everything. She read the clause twice. Her face went through something complex, and then resolved back into the stillness that was her armor. "He poisoned my father to prevent him from contesting the sale," she said. "I believe so. Can you prove it?" "Not yet, but I know where to look." He leaned on the counter. "Abigail, I need you to be careful. If Cutter returns or sends someone, you need to tell me immediately." "What I need," she said, "is for my father to survive." Her voice did not break. He almost wished it would. The control was harder to watch than tears would have been. Thomas Rhodes held on for 11 days after that, and they were 11 days of the most grueling kind of waiting, the kind where hope is not quite extinguished but keeps being rationed into smaller and smaller portions. Abigail split her time between the store and her father's bedside, and Isaac went to both places more than professional necessity required, and he told himself each time that he was checking on the security of the situation, monitoring for any sign of Cutter's return, and this was true, and it was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he could not stay away from her. The whole truth was that watching her move through the worst days of her life, with that particular combination of practicality and heartbreak, had removed the last of his ability to pretend that what he felt was anything other than what it was. He loved her. He had probably loved her since the faro game and the crimped spring, or maybe since the dinner table and the green chili stew, or maybe since the doorway of the post office with the package tucked under her arm. And none of that mattered at all right now, because she was watching her father die. and he was a man with a badge and a dark past full of violence that he had never fully reckoned with. And this was not the moment. He kept the feeling where it was and focused on what he could actually do, which was find evidence. He found it, ultimately, in a supply ledger from the hardware store itself. Arsenic compounds were sold commercially in the 1880s for pest control, and Thomas Rhodes stocked them as a matter of ordinary business. But the store's inventory records, which Abigail had kept with her characteristic precision, showed that one specific compound was missing from the shelving stock in a quantity that was not consistent with sales, not since the week of Cutter's final visit. Something had been removed from the inventory without going through the sale ledger, which meant someone had access to the back of the store without Abigail's knowledge. Isaac also found, after considerable work, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been observed by 3 separate residents in the alley behind the hardware store on the night before Thomas's collapse. Gerald Fitch was not a resident of Redemption Creek. He was, Isaac discovered through his network of contacts across the territory, an associate of Samuel Cutter who had worked with the man in 2 previous operations. He had been in town for 4 days and had left the morning after Thomas collapsed, the same day Cutter himself departed. It was not enough for a judge. It was enough for Isaac. He turned the evidence over to the county sheriff, as well as filing with the territorial marshal's office, and requested warrants. He wrote the clearest, most methodical case summary he had ever produced, marshaling every fact into logical order with the kind of disciplined focus that comes from needing something to be true and knowing that need has no effect on courts of law. Thomas Rhodes died on the morning of the 15th of August. He went peacefully, Dr. Farrow said, which was the kind of sentence that made perfect sense medically and no sense emotionally. Abigail was at his bedside. She held his hand until it cooled. She sat with him for a long time after, and then she stood up and thanked Dr. Farrow and walked out of the physician's office, and through the town and out past the edge of it to the small cemetery on the mesa, where her mother was already buried, where the grave had been dug the previous afternoon in accordance with Thomas's previously expressed wishes, and she pressed her hands against the earth above him, and she cried the way the world ends, slowly and completely and without anything held back. Isaac found her there an hour after he heard the news. He sat beside her in the dirt and he said nothing, and eventually she looked at him and said, "You are the only person in 3 days who has not told me it was God's plan." And he said, "It was not God's plan, it was Samuel Cutter's plan, and I intend to prove it." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman he loved entirely and had never said so, and she said, "Tell me what you have." He told her, all of it. The inventory discrepancy, Gerald Fitch, the reversal clause, and what it meant legally. He told her that he had applied for warrants for both Cutter and Fitch and that he was waiting on the county judge, and that the moment he had the paperwork he was going after Cutter personally, regardless of what the territorial office did or did not do. "You would do that," she said, not a question. "I would." She looked at the grave marker. "He was a good man," she said. "He was not a complicated man, but he was good. He trusted people too easily. That was his only real failing." She paused. "I have the opposite problem." "I know," Isaac said. She looked at him. "Do you?" "I have noticed," he said carefully, "that you do not extend trust without considerable cause. I have also noticed that once you do extend it, you are thorough about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I trust you," she said. It was a simple sentence, and she said it in the same tone she would use to state a fact about inventory or weather or the load-bearing capacity of a shelf, which somehow made it more significant rather than less. "I know," he said again. "I will not waste it." They sat at the grave until the light began to fail, and then Isaac walked her back to the store and made sure the doors were properly secured and checked the back alley himself before he went back to the office. And he sat at his desk in the dark for a long time thinking about betrayal and loyalty, and the hidden cost of a life spent carrying a badge instead of something gentler. The warrant arrived 6 days later. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, signed by Judge Harold Crane of the county court, and it covered Samuel Cutter for fraud, criminal conspiracy, and suspicion of homicide, and a separate warrant covered Gerald Fitch for the same. Isaac pinned his star, loaded his weapons, left Hector Morales in charge of the town, and rode east. He had good information about where Cutter had gone. One of the territory's network of informants, a cattle buyer named Morrison who kept his ears open at every trading post from here to El Paso, had reported seeing Cutter in the town of Copper Flat, 60 miles east, where the man appeared to be establishing himself in another round of land dealings connected to a different railroad branch line. Cutter apparently believed his distance from Redemption Creek was sufficient protection, which was a miscalculation that Isaac intended to make permanently costly. Copper Flat was 3 days' ride in August heat, which gave Isaac 3 days to think about Abigail, which was unhelpful but unavoidable. He thought about the way she read a ledger, her finger moving along the columns with the same attention a musician gives a score. He thought about her voice when she argued with people who underestimated her, which was a voice of almost surgical patience. He thought about her hands on her father's grave and felt the ache of it like a splinter under a nail. He thought about what he would say to her when he came back. He had decided he would say something, finally and directly, because the alternative was continuing the current state of affairs indefinitely, which was no longer something he was willing to do. Life in his profession had taught him that the time you intend to use for important things has a way of being taken away without notice, and he was done saving this particular important thing for a more convenient moment. He found Cutter in Copper Flat on a Friday afternoon, in the parlor of a boarding house, where the man was meeting with a local property owner. Cutter saw Isaac come through the door, and his face did the thing that guilty men's faces do when they are confronted by the specific person they have been hoping to avoid, a tightening and a recalibration that was brief but unmistakable. "Marshal Graves," Cutter said, as though they were acquaintances meeting by pleasant coincidence. "What brings you to Copper Flat?" Isaac placed the warrant on the table between them. "Samuel Cutter, I am placing you under arrest on the authority of the county court. You are charged with fraud, criminal conspiracy, and suspicion of homicide in the death of Thomas Rhodes of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory. You may come willingly or otherwise. The choice will affect your comfort on the ride back but not its destination." Cutter looked at the warrant, he looked at Isaac, he looked at the distance between himself and the door which Isaac had already assessed and which was insufficient by approximately 4 feet. "You have no evidence," Cutter said. "I have a warrant," Isaac said, "which means a judge has already disagreed with you. Stand up." Cutter stood. He did not go for the small pistol that Isaac knew was in his coat pocket, which was a wise choice, and Isaac relieved him of it and cuffed his hands behind him in the way that allowed a man to ride but not to cause trouble, and he brought him out through the parlor while the property owner stared in stunned silence. Gerald Fitch was found 2 days later by a deputy from a neighboring jurisdiction, located through the same informant network, and was transported to the county seat separately. He agreed, once he understood the weight of evidence against him, to provide testimony in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony confirmed everything Isaac had assembled. Cutter had directed him to doctor the arsenic compound that was mixed into a tin of coffee that had been placed in the back storage room of Rhodes Hardware during Cutter's final visit, while Thomas's attention was occupied with the paperwork being discussed. The plan had been precisely calibrated. Thomas would sign, become ill, die within the 90-day window of the reversal clause, and Abigail, having no knowledge of the clause, would not contest the deed in time. Cutter had not counted on Abigail's pattern recognition, or on Isaac's thoroughness, or on the fact that Thomas Rhodes had a daughter who read every document in the business with the same attention her father had given to the weight of nails. The trial took place in late October, in the county courthouse in Santa Cruz. Isaac was the primary witness for the prosecution. He laid out the evidence in precise, chronological order, the inventory records, the testimony about Gerald Fitch's presence, the reversal clause and its legal implications, Fitch's own testimony about the method and means of the poisoning, and the documented pattern of Cutter's previous operations in other territories. He was on the stand for most of a day, and he answered every question in the same measured, methodical tone, and by the time he stepped down the jury had everything they needed. Samuel Cutter was convicted of fraud, criminal conspiracy, and second-degree homicide, and was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Abigail attended the trial. She sat in the public gallery and watched the proceedings with the same composed focus she brought to everything. And when the verdict was read, she closed her eyes for 3 seconds. And Isaac, watching from across the room, thought those 3 seconds contained more feeling than most people's faces showed in a year. Then she opened them and looked at him directly, and what passed between them across that crowded room needed no words. On the ride back to Redemption Creek, they traveled together at her suggestion, having both come on horseback for the 2-day journey to the county seat. The first day they talked about the trial, about the territorial land fraud laws that needed strengthening and the procedural gaps that men like Cutter exploited and what might be done about them. Abigail had thoughts on all of it, specific and informed, and Isaac listened to her with the attention he gave to things that mattered. They camped at a water source about halfway back, a small tributary of the Rio Grande where the cottonwood trees had gone gold in the October air, and they built a small fire and ate the provisions they had brought. And at some point the conversation stopped being about legal reform and became something quieter, and the fire settled into embers, and the dark around them was vast and starred and completely indifferent to whatever happened next. "I need to say something to you," Isaac said. He was looking at the fire. "I have been waiting for you to say it," Abigail said. He looked at her. "You knew." "I notice patterns," she said. "You told me so yourself." She was looking at him with that direct, clear gaze that stripped away every surplus thing. "Isaac, I have been wondering for 3 months whether you were going to trust me with what you actually feel, or whether you were going to keep it folded up in that coat pocket of yours indefinitely." He felt something in his chest release that he had been holding for a very long time. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I had any right to, and I have been waiting for a moment that was not complicated by grief or danger or professional obligation, and I have finally accepted that there is no such moment in this life, so I am telling you now." She looked at him for a long time in the firelight. "It took you long enough," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite a while." She said it in the same tone she used for facts, clear and without decoration, and it was the most beautiful sentence he had heard in his life. "I was beginning to wonder if I was going to have to say it first." "You were prepared to say it first." "I was prepared to do whatever was necessary," she said. "I told you." "I do not wait indefinitely," he laughed. He had not laughed in weeks, and it surprised him, the physical reality of it, how much room it took in his chest. She smiled at him, and the smile was nothing like the composed, careful expression she gave the world. It was unguarded and warm, and it reached her eyes and stayed there, and he moved closer to her across the firelit ground, and she did not move away, and he kissed her with all the patience and all the urgency of everything that had been contained for too long. They arrived back in Redemption Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, and the whole town noticed, in the way small towns notice the things that have been building for months, that something had shifted between the Marshal and Abigail Rhodes. There was no announcement. There was simply the fact of them walking down Main Street together in conversation, and the way he stayed close, and the way she was not the least bit interested in pretending otherwise. The months that followed were the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness that either of them had known in a long time, which is not to say they were without difficulty. Abigail had the practical business of her grief to work through, which she did in her characteristic way, privately and methodically, and there were nights when Isaac sat with her in the kitchen of her father's house while she was quieter than usual, and he simply remained close, the way he had that first afternoon at the grave, understanding that presence was sometimes the only useful thing on offer. He also had his own quiet inventory to take. He had spent 9 years building walls between his inner life and his professional life, and dismantling them, even voluntarily, was not entirely comfortable. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the early days in Kansas, before he had learned to manage the weight of what the work required. About cases that had not ended cleanly. About the particular loneliness of a lawman in a small town who cannot quite afford to be ordinary with the people he is charged with protecting. She listened to all of it with the same attention she gave ledger columns, looking for the places where the numbers did not balance, asking precise questions that helped him understand things he had been carrying around opaquely for years. "You think your work makes you unfit for a permanent life," she said one evening in November. It was a statement, not a question. "I thought that," he said. "For a long time. And now," he looked at her across the table, "now I think I was using it as an excuse not to risk something that might not work out." She tilted her head slightly. "And now you have decided to risk it anyway." "I have decided," he said, "that the alternative is worse." He asked her to marry him on a December evening on the porch of the hardware store, which had remained open under Abigail's management, and was, by her accounting, doing better than it had in 3 years because she had renegotiated the supply contracts and adjusted the inventory system, 2 things she had been wanting to do for some time and which her father had been resistant to. He had a ring that had been his mother's, brought west from Ohio in a cloth pouch inside a coat lining, carried for the 9 years of his lawman life as a kind of ballast, a weight of history he could not quite bring himself to leave behind. He had not known, until now, why he kept it. He told her that when he gave it to her. He told her about the ring and why he had carried it, and why he had not known why until he looked at her. It was not an eloquent speech. He was a man better suited to sworn testimony than declarations, but the honesty of it was absolute, and Abigail, who valued honesty above eloquence without any contest, said yes before he had quite finished the sentence. They were married in February of 1883 in the small white church at the north end of Redemption Creek's Main Street, with half the town in attendance because, in a town of that size, there was simply no such thing as a private wedding if both parties were known to everyone. Hector Morales stood up with Isaac. Abigail was attended by Clara Fontaine, the schoolteacher, who had become her closest friend since the autumn. Reverend Michaels, who had been conducting services in Redemption Creek for 6 years and had seen considerable variety in the marriages he performed, said afterward that this one had the quality of 2 people who had already survived something together, which gave the ceremony a seriousness that he found moving. The winter had been cold but not brutal by New Mexico standards, and by the wedding day the sky was the deep clear blue that follows a hard freeze, and the light coming through the church's plain windows was extraordinarily clean. Abigail wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her exactly right, and Isaac wore his good coat with the badge pinned to it because she had told him, when he offered to leave it off, that the badge was part of who he was and she had married who he was, not a version of him with the inconvenient parts removed. He had loved her for this already. He loved her additionally for this. They kept both of Thomas's houses, the house attached to the hardware store and the marshal's office dwelling on the opposite end of town, and gradually consolidated into a single life in the house beside the store, which was larger and which Abigail had already organized in the ways that suited her, and which Isaac moved into with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, filling the spaces she had left for him with books and the particular orderly accumulation of a methodical man's possessions. Spring came early to Redemption Creek in 1883. By March the mesa was already showing green along its edges, and the early wildflowers were pressing up through the hard ground with the insistence of things that have been waiting all winter for permission. Isaac wrote his regular patrol routes and came home to Abigail in the evenings, and it was nothing like the life he had imagined for himself during the preceding years, because he had not, in those years, been doing much imagining. He had been managing. He had been carrying things carefully from one day to the next, and what he had now was not management. What he had now was an actual life, specific and warm and full of the particular grace that comes from being known by someone who chose to know you. Abigail discovered she was pregnant in April. She told him on a Thursday morning before the store opened, matter-of-factly and with the faint smile of a woman who has already run the numbers and made peace with the variable. And Isaac sat down on the kitchen chair and stared at the table for a moment, and then looked up at her with an expression that she described later to Clara Fontaine as the only time she had ever seen the man genuinely unmoored from his composure. "Say something," she said. "I do not know," he said slowly, "how to do this." "Neither do I," she said. "We will learn." He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her very carefully as though something had become suddenly fragile, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed at his carefulness, and he tightened his arms around her and felt the laugh travel through her. "I am not made of glass," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I am simply holding on." Their son was born in November of 1883, on a Tuesday morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside and the world had gone quiet and white. Dr. Farrow was there. Clara Fontaine was there. Isaac was there, and he was considerably less composed than he had been during the trial of Samuel Cutter, which was a fact that Abigail noted and found endearing in ways she stored for later reference. They named him Thomas Rhodes Graves, for the obvious reason, which was that some things deserved to be carried forward rather than left behind. The boy arrived in the world with his mother's clear, assessing eyes and his father's dark hair, and he cried loudly and without reservation, and Isaac held him in the first hour with the kind of concentrated attention he gave to evidence, taking in the small face and the improbable weight of it and the absolute impossibility of the thing, that this person who had not existed 6 months ago was now indisputably real, and looking at him with those new, unfocused eyes. "Hello," Isaac said to his son very quietly. "I will try to be worthy of this." Abigail, from the bed watching him, said nothing. She did not need to. The feeling in the room was complete without it. The year that followed Thomas's birth was the fullest Isaac had known, which was not without its complications, because a marshal's life did not pause for parenthood, and the territory of New Mexico had not arranged itself to produce only manageable crises. There were the ordinary matters of the law, disputes and thefts, and the occasional violence that frontier life generated from the friction of hard men in hard circumstances. And there was the larger, slower work of the railroad's actual arrival in Redemption Creek in late 1884, which transformed the town in the ways Abigail had predicted it would, some good and some not, bringing new people and new commerce and also new varieties of trouble. The railroad brought competition to the hardware store, as larger supply chains were now more accessible to the territory, and Abigail met this by doing what she did with everything. She analyzed the situation carefully and adapted before the problem became a crisis, expanding into services the supply chains could not provide and building relationships with the ranching families in the surrounding range who needed reliable local supply, and not just what could be ordered and shipped. The store remained solvent through the transition, while 3 other businesses in town did not, which was a tribute to her management and also to her early reading of the situation. Isaac's role in the town grew as the population grew, and he trained 2 additional deputies and worked with the incoming county administration on the legal infrastructure that a growing community required. He was offered the position of county sheriff twice and declined it both times, which surprised people who did not understand him. He explained to Abigail that the county position was about administration and politics, and that his actual calling was the direct work of the law, the specific and personal work of keeping individual people safe in individual circumstances, and that Redemption Creek was where he was needed and where he intended to stay. Abigail had not doubted this. She had never asked him to be other than what he was. They were sitting on the porch in September of 1885, Thomas, a sturdy and determined almost 2-year-old, occupying himself with a set of wooden blocks in the yard, when Abigail said, very casually, "I believe we are going to need a larger bedroom." Isaac looked at her. She met his gaze with that calm, direct expression that was her natural resting state, but which he had learned to read well enough to know when something significant was underneath it. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the sky and felt the enormous, ordinary happiness of it. "When?" "February, approximately." "Thomas will be barely 2. I am aware. I did the arithmetic." He looked at her. She was looking at the yard where their son was constructing something out of the wooden blocks, a structure that had no apparent architectural intention but was being built with enormous commitment. Isaac watched them both, his wife and his son, in the September light, and felt something in his chest that was so large and specific that he could not have named it in a courtroom, could not have built a case around it or reduced it to sworn testimony. It was just there, present and whole, the best evidence he had ever encountered of something worth protecting. "A girl this time, do you think?" he asked. "I have no opinion on the matter," Abigail said. "I will be satisfied with a healthy child and a successful delivery." "Practical as always," he said. "One of us has to be," she said, but she was smiling, and he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, turning her palm up and threading her fingers through his in the uncomplicated way of people who have stopped needing to be careful about what they reveal to each other. The second child was also a boy. They named him James, after Isaac's father, because Abigail felt strongly that the naming should go to Isaac's family this time, and Isaac accepted this with the gratitude he felt for her specific attentiveness to the things that mattered to him, because naming a son after his father was something he had wanted without knowing he was allowed to want it. James arrived in February as predicted, smaller than Thomas had been but considerably noisier about it from the start, which established his character early. Dr. Farrow declared both mother and child healthy. Thomas, who was 2 years and 3 months old and had not yet fully grasped the concept of sharing permanent arrangements, regarded his new brother with the expression of someone presented with a complicated document written in a language he had not yet studied. "He will adjust," Abigail said. "He will," Isaac agreed, watching his older son poke cautiously at his brother's wrapped foot. Thomas adjusted within approximately 6 days, after which he became possessively devoted to James in the way of firstborn children who have decided, having no alternative, to claim the new situation as their own idea. The years that followed were ones that Isaac, when he looked back on them in the quiet moments that a man of his temperament occasionally allowed himself, could only describe as full. Full in every direction, of the work that sustained him and the family that made the work worth sustaining, of Abigail's intelligence and her humor and her absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly herself, of the boys growing from infants into small people with distinct opinions, and the particular energy of children raised in a house where both parents took the world seriously. Thomas developed his mother's gift for patterns, noticing connections and discrepancies in everything around him with the observational focus of a natural analyst. James was different, warmer and more openly expressive, interested in people in the way his father was, though Isaac's interest came out as careful assessment, and James's came out as enthusiastic engagement with every person he encountered. They were different in ways that complemented each other, and watching them together was one of the regular pleasures of Isaac's life. Redemption Creek grew through the late 1880s, population rising from a few hundred to nearly 1,000 as the railroad brought commerce and commerce brought settlers. The character of the town changed and then changed again, and Isaac adjusted his approach each time, always rooted in the same principles he had come in with: thoroughness, honesty, and the particular belief that the law existed to protect people rather than to advantage the powerful. This belief had cost him professionally in his early years in the territory, when certain property owners with political connections had preferred a more flexible interpretation. But the Cutter case and its outcome had established his reputation in a way that made him difficult to simply dismiss. In 1887, there was a situation involving a group of Navajo families who had been displaced from rangeland they had used for generations, and who were being pressured by a new ranching operation with capital behind it. The legal situation was tangled in the way that situations involving federal land policy and native rights were invariably tangled in that era, a web of treaties and violations and bureaucratic incompetence that had been generating injustice for decades. Isaac could not undo any of the structural wrong. He was a town marshal with a limited jurisdiction and no authority over federal land decisions. But he could, and did, ensure that the specific and immediate harassment being directed at the displaced families by the ranching operation's hired hands stopped immediately and completely. And he did this by making it very clear to the hired hands in question that his jurisdiction extended to their behavior regardless of who paid their wages. He told Abigail about it that evening, including the limits of what he had been able to do, and she listened to the whole of it. "You cannot fix what the federal government has been doing for 30 years, she said, but you can be one person in one place who does not add to it. It does not feel sufficient, he said. Most of what is right is not sufficient, she said. That does not make it wrong. He thought about this for a long time. It became, eventually, the principle he tried to convey to his deputies, to Thomas when he was older and asking questions about his father's work, and eventually to James too. Abigail's store continued to be the commercial anchor of the community in ways that exceeded its inventory. She had extended informal credit to multiple families during hard winters, keeping careful records but not pressing collections in ways that would damage people who were already strained. And this generosity, which she would have rejected the label of generosity for, preferring to call it long-term commercial thinking, had created a quality of trust in her relationships with the town's residents that no amount of advertising could have manufactured. People brought her their problems, not just their purchasing lists, and she helped where she could and said so plainly when she could not. The town held a celebration in the summer of 1889 for the territory's approaching statehood discussions, and Isaac was asked to speak, which he did briefly and without ornamentation, saying that what a community owed itself was honesty about its failures and commitment to doing better, which was received with mixed enthusiasm because half the crowd had expected something more congratulatory. Abigail, in the front row, was not among the mixed. She was looking at him with the particular expression that meant she was filing something away for later, and when he came off the platform she said, "You said exactly the right thing," and he believed her because she did not say things she did not mean. On the evening of their 7th anniversary in February of 1890, they sat on the porch after the boys were in bed and the night was cold and clear and impossibly starred, and Isaac said, out of a long, comfortable silence, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," she said. "That first afternoon at the cemetery," he said. "What you must have thought when I sat down without saying anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were unusual," she said. "Everyone else had been talking at me for 3 days, words that were meant to help but were actually about their own discomfort with grief, and you sat down in the dirt and said nothing. It was the most useful thing anyone did." "I did not know what to say," he said honestly. "I never do in those moments, so I said nothing." "It was the right choice," she said. "And then you said it was not God's plan, it was Samuel Cutter's plan, and I intend to prove it. And I thought, this man pays attention. This man will not tell me things that are not true to make me feel better in the short term." She paused. "That was when I knew." "When you knew what?" He asked, though he thought he knew the answer. That you were going to be important to me, she said. That whatever came next you were going to matter. She looked at him in the dark. I was not wrong. He reached for her hand in the cold night air. No, he said, you were not. They sat like that for a long time, and the stars over Redemption Creek were vast, enclosed the way they can only be in high desert country. And the town was quiet, and their house behind them held their sleeping sons. And Isaac Graves, who had spent the first third of his life running toward things and the second third running away from them, held his wife's hand and stayed precisely where he was. In the spring of 1890, Abigail told him she was expecting again, and this time she laughed while she told him, having found his initial reactions to this news on the previous two occasions reliably entertaining. He did not sit down this time. He laughed too, which was itself a change, and pulled her close and said, "A girl this time, possibly." "I have still no opinion on the matter," she said. It was a girl. She arrived in October, healthy and insistent, and with her father's dark hair and her mother's way of looking at things as though she was already categorizing them. And they named her Margaret after Abigail's mother. And Thomas, who was now 6 and considered himself the resident authority on baby management, instructed James, who was 4, in the proper way to hold her, which was a scene Isaac wanted to preserve in some medium better than memory. Margaret Rhodes Graves, known from approximately her second week of life as Maggie in defiance of the more formal name, occupied the house with the considerable authority of a youngest child who has parents and 2 older brothers entirely arranged to her requirements. And she grew from an infant into a small girl who combined her mother's precision with her father's calm, and who could, by the age of 4, identify a logical inconsistency in an adult's stated position and bring it to their attention without any indication that she understood this was considered unusual. "She is going to be formidable," Isaac said, watching his daughter interrogate poor Hector Morales about the inconsistency between 2 things he had said at dinner. "She already is," Abigail said, with the satisfaction of a woman watching a quality she recognizes traveling forward into the next generation. The 1890s brought changes to Redemption Creek and to the territory that neither Isaac nor Abigail had entirely predicted, though Abigail had predicted more of them than most. The railroad's full establishment brought genuine prosperity, but also the harder edges of a more connected economy, the boom and bust cycles that larger market forces imposed on small communities that had previously been more insulated. The hardware store navigated these cycles through Abigail's management, expanding into new lines when the old ones contracted, and never allowing the debt structure to outpace the genuine assets. Isaac served as marshal through all of it, and the town re-elected him, which was the formal term for what was actually a communal agreement that nobody wanted to try replacing him, through 3 renewal terms without serious opposition. He was 42 years old in 1893, and moving through his days with the particular economy of a man who has learned what matters and stopped spending energy on what does not. And the lines in his face that had come from years of hard weather and harder decisions had settled into the geography of a face that had seen things and was not pretending it had not. He was also, which he had not expected to be at this stage of life, genuinely and thoroughly happy, which was a condition he still regarded with a degree of suspicious inspection, the way you look carefully at a too good bargain to see what is wrong with it. He kept waiting for the thing that would undermine it. He kept waiting for the hidden cost to present itself. And the thing that slowly became apparent to him, through years of evidence, was that Abigail was not a bargain with a hidden cost. She was a fact, like geography or weather, real and consistent and present, and what they had built together was the same kind of fact. He told her this one evening when they were sitting in the kitchen after the children were asleep, in the comfortable, unperformed way of their evenings, and she looked at him over her cup of coffee and said, "You waited long enough to believe it." "I believe it now," he said. "Good," she said. "I have believed it for some time." Thomas, who was 17 in 1900, had begun talking about law school, which Isaac supported with more emotion than he showed. The boy had his mother's analytical mind and had been absorbing everything about his father's work since he was old enough to ask questions, and the combination suggested a future in law that would be very different from his father's particular path, but that grew from the same root. James, who was 15, had developed an interest in engineering and was corresponding with a school in Denver, and Isaac found himself astonished on a regular basis that these specific people who had such specific and fully formed inner lives had come from the kitchen and the porch and the ordinary days of Redemption Creek. Maggie, who was 10 and had opinions about everything, had already declared she intended to run a business, which surprised no one and which Abigail was equipping her for with the same methodical attention she gave everything she cared about. On a Sunday morning in late October of 1900, Isaac and Abigail walked to the Mesa Cemetery to visit the graves, Thomas Rhodes and Margaret Rhodes side by side on the high ground with the view of the valley below. The same view Abigail had been pressing her hands against 18 years before when Isaac sat down beside her in the dirt and changed both their lives by saying nothing. They stood together at the markers for a quiet while. The cottonwoods along the creek far below were yellow gold in the October light, and the air was cold and clean and scented with sage, and behind them the town they had both chosen spread itself across the desert floor, a permanent thing now, with its brick buildings and its railroad station and its nearly 1,000 souls going about their Sunday morning. "I think about him often," Abigail said. She was looking at her father's marker. "He would have loved the children enormously." "He would," Isaac said. "He would have spoiled them catastrophically and felt no remorse about it." She laughed, that unguarded laugh that was still, after all these years, the thing that reached furthest into him. He absolutely would have. Isaac put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood together on the mesa where he had found her crying and sat down beside her without a word, and the world around them was nothing like what it had been then, and exactly like what it had always been in its essential nature, which was real and hard and beautiful and worth every last sustained effort of loving it correctly. "Are you happy?" she asked him. She asked him this occasionally, not as a demand or an interrogation but as a genuine inquiry, because she was a woman who believed in checking the actual data rather than assuming. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Are you?" She considered it in the way she considered everything, with a brief, genuine weighing of the available evidence. "Profoundly," she said. He held her closer against the October cold, and she let him, and the graves of Thomas and Margaret Rhodes stood in the morning light as they would stand for decades more, markers of loss and also of everything that had grown from loss, the life their daughter had built on the foundation of what she carried from them. When they walked back down to the town, Isaac and Abigail Graves walked the way they always walked, close enough to be unmistakably together, at the pace of two people who have somewhere to be but no need to hurry, because the somewhere is not a destination you are racing toward but a life you are already living. Hector Morales, who had been Isaac's deputy for nearly 20 years and was now his senior deputy and more or less the operational backbone of the marshal's office, was sitting on the steps of the office when they passed, and he tipped his hat to Abigail and nodded to Isaac with the particular nod of a man who has watched something good develop over many years and found his satisfaction in the observation. "Morning, Marshal," he said. "Quiet night." "Good," Isaac said. "Mrs. Graves," Hector said, with the formality he had maintained for all 20 years despite Abigail's repeated suggestions that she preferred her name. "Good morning, Hector," Abigail said. "Are you coming to dinner this Sunday?" "If it's no trouble," he said. "It is never trouble," she said, which was true, because Hector Morales had eaten at their table so many times that he had his own chair, and their children called him Uncle Hector, and some things in a life are not dramatic or hidden or secret, but are simply the ordinary permanent good of knowing someone reliably year after year. They went home, and the house was already full of the sounds of Thomas and James debating something at significant volume and Maggie delivering a judgment on the debate that both brothers appeared to find authoritative. And the kitchen smelled of coffee and the morning's bread. And Isaac stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone saw him and looked at all of it, the particular ordinary chaos of a full house on a Sunday morning, and felt the solidity of it in his chest, like the most reliable thing he had ever held as evidence. Abigail came in from the porch where she had paused to look at something in the garden and found him standing in the kitchen doorway with that expression she had catalogued years ago, the one that meant he was taking stock of something and finding it exactly as he hoped. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Noticing," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this man she had trusted at a grave in August heat when he sat down without saying a word. This man she had watched build evidence of love the way he built evidence of guilt, methodically and without false steps, this man who was the finest specific fact of her life. "Well," she said, "come inside. Breakfast will not make itself." He came inside. He sat at the table with his children and his wife, and the conversation that moved around him with the easy generosity of people who have known each other long enough to speak freely. And he drank his coffee, and listened and contributed where he had something to offer. And the October light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in the golden way of October light, which has a quality to it that suggests preservation, as though it is aware of its own beauty and wishes things to be remembered. Thomas was explaining something about a legal case he had been reading about. James was drawing something on the margin of the newspaper that looked like a bridge design. Maggie was eating her breakfast with one hand and pointing out the flaw in Thomas's analysis with the other, with the characteristic lack of ceremony that would serve her well in business and in life. Abigail was listening to all three simultaneously and adding to each thread at intervals, and Isaac sat in the middle of all of it and understood, as he had been gradually understanding for years, that this was what he had been built for without knowing it. Not the badge alone, not the solitary, methodical work of the law in isolation, but this also, the full weight of it. The love that had cracked him open at a cemetery in August of 1882 and rebuilt him into someone with enough room to hold all of this. The winter of 1900 came and settled into Redemption Creek with the comfortable authority of seasons, in a place that has been enduring them long enough to take them as they come. And the Graves family moved through it as they moved through everything, together, and with attention, and without pretending that any of it was simpler than it was. Isaac rode his roots in the cold and came home to the warmth and the noise, and Abigail ran the store and the household, and the particular enterprise of three children in different stages of becoming themselves, and they met at the end of each day in the kitchen, with the coffee, and the easy, honest conversation of people who have long since stopped performing for each other. There was still occasional difficulty. There was always difficulty in a lawman's life, and in a frontier business, and in the matter of raising three children who each had strong opinions and sufficient backbone to act on them. There were nights when the weight of it accumulated, and Isaac sat quietly with the specific shadow that never fully left a man who had done his kind of work for 20-odd years. Abigail sat with him in those times the way he had sat with her at the grave, close and present and without forcing resolution. "You do not have to fix it," she told him once, when he was working through a case that had ended badly, a young man who had come to a violent end before Isaac could prevent it. "I know," he said. "But you are going to spend several days trying to retroactively fix it anyway," she said. "Probably," he said. "That is all right," she said. "I will be here." He looked at her. 23 years into knowing her, 12 years into being loved by her, and she still had the capacity to say something that reached directly through every layer of his self-management and landed in the actual center of the matter. "I know," he said. "It helps." "Good," she said. "That is what I am here for." He reached for her hand across the kitchen table, and she gave it to him, and they sat with the ordinary, extraordinary fact of each other in the warm kitchen, while the winter dark pressed against the windows. And it was enough. And it was more than enough. And it was the whole specific, irreplaceable content of a life worth living. In the spring of 1902, Thomas left for law school in Santa Fe, and they stood on the station platform and watched his train leave with the dignified composure of parents who had prepared themselves thoroughly for this, and were nonetheless blindsided by the reality of it. Abigail stood straight and held her handkerchief in her hand without using it until the train rounded the bend and disappeared, and then she pressed it briefly to her face and put it away. James, who was 17, put his arm around her in a gesture so closely patterned on his father's characteristic comfort that Isaac felt his heart press against his ribs in the most complicated way. Maggie, who was 11, took her mother's hand and said nothing, which was the most deliberately chosen response in the family and had clearly been learned from watching her father from infancy. "He will be back for Christmas," Isaac said. "Of course he will," Abigail said, in the tone of someone who has already made this calculation and arrived at a result they can live with. They walked back to town together, the four of them, and the spring morning was bright and the smell of the new season was in the warm air, and James was already talking about his correspondence with the engineering school in Denver, and Maggie was asking questions about the engineering school that were more sophisticated than the ones James had asked. And Isaac and Abigail walked behind their children and exchanged a glance that contained 20 years of knowing each other, which is its own complete language. Thomas did come back for Christmas. He came back the following summer and worked in the county legal office in Santa Cruz as a clerk. He came back every year, and eventually he came back permanently, establishing a law practice in Redemption Creek in 1907 that served the county with the same thoroughness that his father's marshal work had always demonstrated. And the name Graves became, in that corner of New Mexico, a word associated with reliable honesty and scrupulous attention to what was actually right rather than what was merely convenient. James went to Denver. He became an engineer with the railroad, which had a pleasing circularity that he acknowledged once with a brief, dry humor that was entirely his father's. Maggie stayed in Redemption Creek and took over the hardware store from her mother at the age of 23, having spent the preceding years learning every element of the business from the inside out, and she ran it with her mother's precision and her own considerable added capacity for expansion, growing it into the largest supply operation in the county by 1915. Isaac retired from the marshal's position in 1910 at 59 years old, after 28 years of service to Redemption Creek and the surrounding territory. The retirement was not entirely voluntary, in the sense that Abigail had presented him with a clear and evidentially supported case for it over the preceding 2 years, arguing that his body had been indicating a need for reduced physical demand for some time, and that his habit of ignoring this indicator was unsustainable. He had reviewed her case, acknowledged its strength, and retired on a July morning with a ceremony that involved half the town, a great deal of food that various families contributed, and a speech from Judge Patterson of the county court that described Isaac Graves as the most consistently honest peace officer in the territory's history, which Isaac received with the discomfort of a man who has never been comfortable with formal praise and cannot stop thinking of the specific cases where he had not been enough. Abigail stood beside him through the ceremony with her hand in the crook of his arm, and afterward, when the crowd had thinned and they were walking home through the evening, she said, "The judge was right. He was generous," Isaac said. "He was accurate," she said. "You can disagree with the assessment all you want. The record does not change." He looked at her sideways in the way he still did when she said something that hit the truth cleanly, and he was not quite ready to accept it. "The record includes considerable failure," he said. "The record of any honest effort does," she said. "That is not a diminishment. That is the nature of trying." He thought about this for the rest of the evening, which was her gift, the thing she had been doing for him since the grave on the mesa, cracking the right thing open so the light could get to it. They lived in the house beside the hardware store through the decade that followed, and the rhythm of their days was different without the badge and the office and the weight of the town's safety to carry. And Isaac found that the transition was both harder and easier than he had expected. Harder because he had been defined by the work for 28 years and identity, when you strip part of it away, needs time to reconstitute. Easier because what remained when the work pulled back was enormous and already there and had been there all along. Abigail and the children and the grandchildren who began arriving as Thomas and James settled into their own families. Thomas married a woman named Catherine Reyes, who was a school teacher, and who had the quality of patience that was entirely her own rather than anything resembling either of her in-laws, which was perhaps why the marriage worked as well as it did. They had 2 daughters and a son. James married a woman named Ellen Whitfield from Denver and had 3 boys and a daughter, and lived in a house that was largely of his own engineering design, which created occasional structural surprises that the family took in stride. Maggie, who had been presented with many potential suitors over many years and had assessed each of them with her characteristic clarity and found them insufficient, finally met a man named Robert Crane, the county judge's nephew and a land surveyor by training, who was the first person in her adult experience who could follow every line of her reasoning without losing the thread or requiring her to slow down. And she married him at 31 in a wedding that the whole county attended, because there was no way to have a small wedding when both families were that well known in the territory. Isaac and Abigail attended all of these events as the particular kind of guests of honor who are present not for ceremony, but because everything has grown from them. And the sight of Isaac Graves at a family table, older now, silver at his temples and the weight of years in his face, laughing with his grandchildren, and watching Abigail across the table with that same looking at something too bright expression he had first worn at Thomas Rhodes's kitchen table in the summer of 1882. Was the kind of sight that people who witnessed it remembered long afterward. He was 68 years old in 1919, and the world had changed in ways neither of them could have anticipated when they were young. The war in Europe, the transformations of the century turning, the whole great upheaval of a world reorganizing itself. Redemption Creek had changed with everything else, grown into a proper town with a proper infrastructure, and a population that no longer fit in a single church and businesses that would have been unrecognizable to the early settlers. But the house beside the hardware store was the house it had always been, and the Mesa Cemetery was still there on the high ground with its view of the valley, and Thomas Rhodes's marker stood where it had always stood next to Margaret's, and Isaac and Abigail still walked up there occasionally, not often now. The climb was steeper on older legs, but when they did they stood together at the graves and spoke to who was buried there in the unceremonious way of people who are past performing for anyone. On a late September afternoon in 1919, they made the walk together in the warm, slanted light of early autumn and stood at the graves as they had many times, and Abigail said to her father's marker, "The children are well. Thomas has your eyes still, though he would argue the point. Maggie has your stubbornness, which she uses more productively than you ever admitted you did." She paused. "Isaac is here. He is always here." Isaac stood beside her, his hand at the small of her back, and the mesa wind moved through them both, warm and carrying the smell of sage and distance. "I sat down here 37 years ago," he said, "right here in the dirt, and said nothing," she said. "And said nothing," he confirmed. She turned to look at him, this woman at 61 who was still the most specifically real person he had ever known, whose eyes were still that impossible color between brown and green, whose mind still moved faster and more precisely than his in the directions that mattered most, who had been his partner in every meaning of the word for 36 years of marriage and a few charged weeks before that. "It was the right thing," she said. "Occasionally I get it right," he said. She smiled, the smile that was not for the world, the one he had been the recipient of since a kitchen table in 1882, the one that had made him look away at first because it was too much to hold. He did not look away anymore. He had learned, over the long years of loving her, to hold it. They walked back down from the mesa together in the afternoon light, taking their time, and the town spread below them was full and real and permanent, in the way of things that have been built with care by people who intended to stay. And everything was as it should be. And the story that had begun with a man sitting down in the dirt beside a grieving woman, and saying nothing had arrived at exactly the place such stories deserve to arrive. Not the absence of difficulty, not the absence of grief or loss or the ordinary weight of living, but the presence, steady and irreducible, of two people who had chosen each other on a mesa in August heat and kept making that choice through every subsequent year, and the life that grew from that choosing, full and specific in theirs, extending now into a third generation in the houses and businesses of a town in New Mexico that bore, in its bones, the particular mark of people who had taken it seriously. Isaac held the gate open at the bottom of the trail and Abigail passed through it, and he followed, and they walked home together through the golden September afternoon, and the story was closed.